Chapter 1. It was April, and outside in the dark, the rain whipped against the windows of our tavern, making a sound like muffled drums. We were concentrating on our dinner, and everybody jumped when the door slammed open and banged against the wall, making the plates rattle in their racks. My brother Sam was standing there, wearing a uniform. Oh my, he looked proud. "Sam," my mother said. We hadn't seen him since Christmas. "Shut the door," Father said. "The rain is blowing in." That's the way Father was. Do right first and then be friendly. But Sam was too excited to pay attention. "We've beaten the British in Massachusetts," she shouted. "Who has beaten the British?" Father said. Sam shut the door. "We have," he said, with his back to us as he slipped the latch in place. "The Minutemen. The damn lobster backs marched out of Boston yesterday. They were looking for Mr. Adams and Mr. Hancock, and they marched up to Lexington. Some of the Massachusetts Minutemen tried to stop them there in the square, but there were too many British, and they got through and went up onto Concord looking for ammunition stores. But the Patriots got the stores hidden mostly, and they didn't find much. And then, when they turned around and went back, the Minutemen hid in the fields along the roads and massacred them all the way back to Boston." Nobody said anything. They were silent and shocked. I couldn't take my eyes off him. He looked so brave. He was wearing a scarlet coat with silver buttons and a white vest and black leggings halfway up to his knees. Oh, I envied him. He knew everybody was staring, but he liked being the center of attention, and he pretended it was just an ordinary thing, and he was used to it. "I'm starved," he said, and sat down on the table. "I started out from Yale at 6 o'clock this morning and didn't stop to eat all the way." There were 7 of us at the table in the tap room. Mother and Father and me were there. Then there was the minister, Mr. Beach, who lived in Newtown, but spent Saturday night here in Reading so he could preach in our church early Sunday morning. Then there were a couple of farmers from Reading Center I didn't know, and, of course, Sam. But still, they all sat silent. I guess they figured that it was up to Father to speak first, seeing as Sam was his son. My mother got up, fetched a plate from the rack, and filled it with stew from the iron pot on the fire. Then she drew Sam a pot of beer from the tap and put it down in front of him. He was hungry, and he bent over his plate and began shoving in the food as fast as he could. "Don't eat like that," Father snapped. Sam looked embarrassed and sat up straight. "All right now," Father said. "Tell us the news again in an orderly manner." Father had a temper, and I could see he was trying hard not to lose it. Sam dug his spoon into the stew and started to fill his mouth. But suddenly he realized that if he began talking with his mouth full, Father would yell at him again, so he put the spoonful of stew back on his plate. "Well, it's hard to tell it orderly, Father. There were so many rumors around New Haven last night that—" "I thought it might be like that," Father said. No. It's true about the fighting," Sam said. "Captain Arnold told us himself." "Captain Arnold?" "Captain Benedict Arnold. He's the captain of the governor's second foot guard." He looked down at his stew. "That's my company." He looked up and gave Father a quick, sort of scared look. "That explains the fancy dress, I imagine," Father said. "Captain Arnold designed the uniform." "Never mind, tell the story." "Well, the beginning was when the lobsterbacks—" "By that, I suppose you mean the soldiers of your king?" Father said. He was still holding on to his temper. Sam blushed. "All right, the British troops from the garrison in Boston. They marched up to Lexington looking for Mr. Adams and the rest, but they'd got away. Somebody signaled them from some church steeple in Boston. So when the British got up to Lexington, there wasn't anybody there except the Minutemen. Then the shooting started." Mr. Beach put his hand up to stop Sam. "Who shot first, Sam?" Sam looked confused. "Well, I guess the British. I mean, that's what they said in New Haven." "Who said?" "Well, I'm not sure," Sam said. "I guess it's too hard to tell in a battle. But anyway, Sam," Father said. "Who do you think fired first?" "I don't know, Father. I don't know, but anyway, I should think it might matter to know, Sam," Father said. Why does it matter? Sam was beginning to lose his temper the way he did. What right have the lobsterbacks to be here anyway? I thought it was pretty funny that he kept calling the British lobsterbacks when he was dressed in red, too. All right, Mr. Beach said. Let's not argue the point. What happened then? Yes, sir, Sam said. So anyway, some men were killed. I don't know how many. And then the British went on up to some place called Concord, looking for ammunition stores there. But they didn't find very much and turned around and started back to Boston. That's when the Minutemen really peppered them. They chased them all the way back home. Quickly, Sam began to eat his stew before they had time to ask him more questions. Darn it, that's rebellion, one of the farmers said. They'll have us in war yet. Mr. Beach shook his head. I think men of common sense will prevail. Nobody wants rebellion except fools and hotheads. That's not what they say in New Haven, sir, Sam said. They say that the whole colony of Massachusetts is ready to fight, and if Massachusetts fights, Connecticut will fight too. Finally, my father lost his temper and slammed his hand down on the table, making the plates jump. I will not have treason spoken in my house, Sam. Father, that isn't true. Father raised his hand, and for a moment I thought he was going to reach across the table and hit Sam. But instead he slammed it down on the table again. In my house, I will decide what constitutes treason. What have they been teaching you at college? Mr. Beach liked peace. I don't think the people of Reading are anxious to fight Sam, he said. Sam was nervous, but being Sam, he was bound to argue. You get the wrong idea from Reading, sir. There's a lot more Tories in this part of Connecticut than in the rest of the colonies. In New Haven, there aren't so many loyalists, and in some towns, there aren't any at all. Oh, Sam, Mr. Beach said, I think you'll find that loyalty is a virtue everywhere. We've had these things before. The vicious nonsense of those madmen dressed up like Indians and throwing tea into the Boston Harbor, as if wetting a few hundredweight of tea would stop the mightiest army on the face of the earth. These agitators can always manage to stir up the passions of the people for a week or so, but it never lasts. A month later, everybody's forgotten it, except the wives and children of the men who've managed to get themselves killed. Sir, it's worth dying to be free. That made Father shout. Free? Free to do what, Sam? Free to mock your king? To shoot your neighbor? To make a mess of thousands of lives? Where have you been getting these ideas? You don't understand, Father. You just don't understand. If they won't let us be free, we have to fight. Why should they get rich off our taxes back in England? They're 3,000 miles away. How can they make laws for us? They have no idea how things are here. It made me nervous to listen to Sam argue with Father. I could see that Mr. Beach wanted to quiet him down before he and Father got into a real fight, the way they sometimes did. God meant man to obey. He meant children to obey their fathers. He meant men to obey their kings. And as a subject of the Lord our God, I don't question his ways. As a subject of his majesty, George III, should you question his ways? Answer me this, Sam. Do you really think you know better than the king and those learned men in Parliament? Some of those men in Parliament agree with me, sir. Not many, Sam. Edmund Burke. Father lost his temper again. He banged his hand down on the table one more time. Sam, there will be no more talk on this tonight. He meant it, and Sam knew he meant it too. So he shut up, and the conversation turned to repairs Mr. Beach wanted to make at the church. I was glad, too. It scared me when Sam argued with the grown-ups like that. Of course, Sam was that way, always shooting out whatever came into his mind, and sometimes even getting hit by my father for it. Father hardly ever hit me, but he hit Sam dozens of times, mostly for arguing. Mother always said, Sam isn't really rebellious, just too quick with his tongue. But if he'd only learned to stop and think before he spoke. But Sam couldn't seem to learn like that. My mother hated it when Father hit Sam for speaking out, but there wasn't anything she could do about it. And anyway, she believed that Father was right. Children ought to keep a civil tongue in their heads. I guess he was right. Children are supposed to keep quiet and not say anything, even when they know the grown-ups are wrong. But sometimes it's hard. Sometimes I have trouble keeping quiet myself. although not near as much trouble as Sam.